Welcome back to the Athlete's Edge podcast. On today's episode, we're unpacking a recent podcast we both listened to around some crazy statistics when it comes to female training, why they face a significant higher risk of ACL tears, and the decline in participation rates and the reasons for that. So we both listened to the Strength Coach podcast this week, and they had a guest on, Justin Kegley, who works a lot with female athletes over in the US. And I wanted to get your take and perspective on their discussion. And a statistic that came up was that girls in puberty that are training can gain a 13.4% better control of their lower extremities compared to those girls who don't lose 21.7% of control over their lower extremities. So what's the reason for that in your opinion?
I like how you picked that one up first, Harry. And so we're talking athletes here, to be clear. So I think it ties into our discussion last week. So for those that didn't see it, and probably messaging we've been putting out the last few weeks. So for those that have been missing all of that, while playing sport and training for sport there's a lot of positives that come from that. I don't think that's disputing. We're obviously very passionate about sport. You're still playing at a high level, and I miss it, to be honest. But what is missed is a lot of the skill coordination stuff that comes from deliberately trying to improve those things. And that's where the gym and athletic development done well fits that gap. So what we're talking about there is kids that do, young athletes, particularly girls that do that neuromuscular training. So whether that's incorporating some strength, some balance, some control, so basically good athletic development, even though the sport is trying to break down their body and disrupt that to a degree, which is what's happening in that other group where they're declining by just over 20%, we can not only mitigate that decline, we can actually improve while all this sport is taking place. Whereas those that neglect the extra work to help maintain a healthy body and quality of movement, sport actually breaks you down and makes that worse.
And when it comes to, I guess, the actual training exercises, I know you're a big fan of the stability, coordination, control, even some single leg strength and training. So why are you such a big fan of that when it comes to sort of athlete development? And how does that tie into obviously the females and I guess preventing them from doing ACLs because they do have a bit more of a high risk?
Yeah, well, I think we'll get into the risk stuff in a second, but I think it's just good training. So when I look at transfer, and I've made this mistake in my career with athletes, is getting strong for the sake of being strong doesn't help you, because what you're improving, if you break it down, so think of like a back squat. Yes, there's some general strength there to be able to squat heavier. But what we're doing is once we get past that initial learning curve, essentially everything we're training for is the back squat. So it gets to a point where all that time you've got to spend in improving that and continually to be able to lift heavier in a back squat, it's specific to the back squat. So this comes about a lot from powerlifting because they squat. That is their sport. So what we've got to be mindful of is where these influences come from. And the more I've got to know, the more I question why do we believe this to be true. And so for me, strength is one of those things that if I said, for example, like, yes, the forces to insanely high, in sprinting and deceleration relative to what we do in the gym. But that comes from the fact that it's reasonably high forces, but applied really quickly. So it's body weight that is applied in a really, really short amount of time that creates really high peak forces. Now, when we look at a squat and we look at the peak force there going through the floor, for example, it's actually not that high. Because it's a really slow movement. So at some point, the transfer starts to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And that happens pretty quickly for gym exercises because they're gym exercises. They're not the sport. So how do we make it more specific? Well, things like single leg strength to me tick a lot more boxes because yes, we're still getting the squat pattern. So like a single leg squat, for example, we can still work the squat, but now we're getting stability in around the hip because you're on one leg. So now it's not just the primary muscles that are working. Now a lot of the stabilizers, your adductors, your glute med on the side of your hip, all these muscles have to help balance out, against rotation and what the opposite hip's doing so it doesn't drop down, which is what we see in a lot of change of direction. It's more specific because sprinting, jumping a lot of the time, landing, decelerations are happening one leg and then the other. So I'd say it's a bit more specific. It trains more of the qualities we're looking for. And then, it's still going to leave a lot of things short, but that's why we sprint and we jump and we do those things as well.
And if we kind of touch on the ACL risk, especially in females, it's funny, they kind of said their ACL prevention is just good training.
Yeah.
So they also did have a statistic around that less than 20% of female athletes are doing some sort of neuromuscular training of some sort in addition to their sporting loads, which obviously, so how does, I guess, their schedule affect their sort of risk factor?
Well, I would say it's a bit of a myth busting first. It's a bit of a myth that I think that females have a higher ACL risk because they're female. I don't think it's as much to do with hormones as everyone wants us to believe. Yes, there's going to be some individual differences in there, just like in blokes. And there's some research out to kind of prove this, that it almost debunks it when they normalise it for some other variables, which is what you're talking about there. So what we know is, and I can talk to a female athlete I've worked with, and she goes off and plays high-level college basketball. And so when she was back in the last off-season, we were talking about exactly this topic. And I said, what access to the gym do you guys get in comparison? And they said, so in the pre-season, we're in there a bit, 2 to 3 times a week. What's it look like? And it's pretty much very, very light weights, bit of circuit stuff, not much strength development, a little bit. And then she said that drops right off in season. So they only really get maybe a bit of strength stuff twice a week for maybe 2 months. The rest of the year, it's very basic, a lot of sort of stretching body weight stuff. I said, what do the boys program get? She said, they're in there every day trying to PB. So then when we look at, so like the emphasis on strength is just not the same in females. And then I was like, what's your high performance head of S&C like? And generally, pretty new. The boys has come from an MBA program. So the skill level of the staff is arguably very different.
We were having this exact chat, on Monday morning after our swim around that kind of the resources that the girls have access to is, because a lot of the time, most of the coaches strive to coach males because that's kind of seen as the more professional sport and the high level of coaching. So that often means a lot of the lesser coaches or development coaches get not stuck with, but they get put with the female athletes.
So they get a foot in the door.
Yeah.
Whereas we can argue that the girls need it more to bridge that gap. So they need the better coach. Like I've always said, in the football pathway, the best coaches in the AFL should be working under 18 level. You don't need to be as good in the AFL because the players are better. We've got to teach them before they get there. So we actually need our better coaches working with the development phase, and then we just got to maintain, fine-tune at the high level. So it's different. So I'd say there's a massive training gap. So, and that's a little bit the culture. But we see, in the boys space, 10 to 15 years of like academy programs to get to a certain point. Whereas in the girls, it might be a couple of years. So there's this big, training gap in and around the sport. There's a big training gap in and around the priority for strength and power and movement skills in the gym. And then, like we touched on, like the environment, there's a big inequity in the knowledge of coaches and staff and just funding. So I would say that has more to do with the ACL risk than actual being female.
So if we switch up to sort of participation rates, this is obviously a bit more of a US stat, but 70% of kids are quitting sports now before 14. Reps starting earlier, people are travelling across the country in order just to get seen. Local coaches, rep coaches are prioritising, I guess, winning more so over development. So what kind of gaps does that leave in the training that these athletes get exposed to?
Well, I think we're seeing it in the top level. I think we're seeing in some ways always be successful because of your top few. There's just enough talent that the top few picks in every draft in all sports are kind of good enough. But I would say that, you follow AFL even closer than I. Are we seeing a massive jump in the standard of the sport?
It's hard to say because of the...
Like if you think
the
back to
rule
the Gary
changes.
Ablett seniors and the Wayne Careys are we seeing better footballers now despite everything that's going into junior sport and the money that's involved?
I would probably argue yes, but I think that's more just to do with evolution, more so than the training. Like, I don't think people could do sort of what Nick Dacos does, what Nasai Wanganeen-Milera does. You could probably argue that this day and age, people are less skilled in terms of their
That's
dexterity.
what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about.
They can't use both sides of their body. You watch...
Because I would say you're just too young. Because I would say Nick Dacos isn't as good as some of the blokes 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Andrew McLeod, Michael Voss, Jason Ackermanis.
Different styles of player, but yeah.
And I've heard Dale Thomas and Stevie Johnson, these guys talk about this before, saying that even at the end of their careers, they were better kicks than the current greats on both sides of their body. So a lot of the guys can't kick on their left foot. It wasn't that long ago you didn't get picked for the talent pathway if you couldn't kick both sides of the body. I think our skill standards are dropping because the skills are dropping.
Yeah. I'd say, I'd probably rephrase and say that in terms of the evolution, I think they're better athletes nowadays just because of the resources and access and the knowledge that I guess the staff now have. But in terms of, the actual skill level across the board, I would say it's probably, obviously a bit more of a dip.
And I think that is the cost of the early specialisation and the priority on making teams, winning games, and focusing on the outcome of getting drafted or making a college, as opposed to drilling down into what does it take, what are the behaviours to get there, because that's what development's all about. And this is true for sport and even not sport, personal development. So there's a trade-off, and I think the concern is, what is that doing to our kids? Just outside of like the actual talent pool, around confidence. Like, I got into this game because of what I struggled mostly with. I'd say always reasonably talented. What held me back the most was a lack of confidence. For whatever reason, just the fear of making mistakes. I would almost rather not have the ball than to have it make a mistake. I was talking about this with this kid this morning who's always run a bad time on the last sprint. I was like, I'm not a fan of that mindset. And the reason why you say that is because you would rather run a bad time and be right than to run a good time. Because that's a confidence thing. Like, you're feeding your own ego and by being right. So you're telling yourself something that you don't actually really want to happen, but if it does, now you're right, so now you feel better about yourself. We want kids to be confident and comfortable failing. And that's where in this podcast, Coach was doing a great job around his environment, where he makes it really comfortable in kids making mistakes. And I think that's where kids get a lot of confidence from the gym, because you're always trying to do something that you haven't done before. It's a pretty safe way to fail. Like, you kick a hurdle over, no big deal. You're probably not going to, we don't want kids failing on key lifts or anything where it is a bit risky. But if you get your technique a little bit wrong and lean a bit forward, or you sit down in a box and you couldn't get up that next rep, and then you get up, a second later, that's all the body and the brain trying to figure out, I didn't do that right, I can do it better. And then you see, like reps go up, you can lift more weights, you can jump high, you can do these things like little progressions, a little constant feedbacks is I'm getting better. But in that process, you've got to be confident that you can fail in order to get better. What happens a lot is that coaches and parents, and as a parent now myself, I'm really conscious of my language, that we draw attention to the outcome. Like, as parents, for example, we shouldn't care about winning. We shouldn't care about them making teams. How many parents can actually sit down and say they don't talk about the game afterwards in the car ride home?
Yeah, probably not many.
And they shouldn't. You should not even bring up the game. It should be like, all I would say is, I love you. I love watching you play sport. And then maybe if the effort was good, then the effort you brought today was fantastic. Leave it there. Like, you're not their coach. So don't coach them on, you missed this kick, you did that, and point out all their flaws, because now they're just worried about your approval. So then they're going to pull themselves out of those situations. So they're not going to get better. And then the only thing I would say you coach on is if they did say, yeah, well, the effort was a bit flat, like, are you okay? But do it from the point of the parent and like, can I support you? Not from the point of the coach and say, yeah, why you got to do better? Yeah, we need more effort, you know? And I get it, parents put money in their time, they travel, they do all this stuff, but you do that because you're the parent, not because you want the outcome. And if you're doing it for the outcome, you're doing it for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, I think you're doing it for yourself more than them.
Exactly. So I would never bring up the cost of training or anything like that to my son. I would teach him about money and saving, but it's not going to be through the things I invest for him, because I want him just to focus on enjoying it and bringing effort. So focus on the behaviours. I don't want him to be worrying about the outcome and all the sacrifice and stuff, because that's a different lesson in my opinion. And I think where that relates to the girls is, I think, not always, like boys and girls, there's heaps of individuality within that, but I just think they're pretty in tune to this stuff, and that's why I think we see a higher dropout rate in the girls up until that sort of 15, 16, and particularly after that, like participation rates sort of fall off a cliff, is because I guess they just get fed up quicker. I think they realise that earlier, so then they just like, oh, it's not worth it. Like, I don't want all this extra pressure and stress, and so then they put their attention somewhere else, which sometimes isn't in good things. So I think that's where, if we want really, talking about the girl space, we want really confident women that can have, really positive relationships with sport, with exercise, with their body, with relationships, with people they got to work with boyfriends and husbands and kids and this stuff. Well, a lot of it starts with the mindset they get now, and we got to be careful that in our attempt for us to feel good, we don't destroy their kind of self-esteem and their drive to improve.
And I guess a last sort of discussion point just around, even to go back to an earlier discussion there, was around even how many first round picks do we see that miss pretty much their draft year or the year after they get drafted through ACL, through a stress fracture in their back or foot or whatever, just because of the missed development in that early teenage years when they're sort of prioritising more games, more training, instead of actually working on their inputs like their speed and strength. Because it was funny, in the podcast they said, what's the point of trying to what are you actually showcasing in those games, because you actually haven't maximise your performance, because you haven't developed your strength and speed. So what are you actually showcasing in your rep games and all that kind of thing? Yeah,
there's a couple of good points there, which I kind of had in my head and then we moved on. But so I start on that last one. I agree. Like, you're better off, you should have the mindset of, we haven't done the work this week. We're actually going to pull out of the game until we get the week right and our preparation right. Whereas they're especially in the States where they got showcase games and all these scouts are coming. But it's the same into the AFL space with recruiters. It's almost like, I will sacrifice that in order to perform for the recruiters. But the funny thing is, you don't perform because you're not ready to perform, because you haven't done the work. So it's, sometimes we get ahead of ourselves, and as a result, we wonder why performance essentially falls in a heap and we don't reach the heights we want to reach. Now, some do, and some of the time it's just talent and chance and just, a bit of luck, the right environment. And they're the ones you talk about, in that I don't think the draft works, in the sense that go through the last 5 years and look at the top 20 picks and see how many names you don't actually know. And it's because they were peaking and focusing maybe on the outcome early on, therefore got the outcome, but then realised they weren't up to the standard once they got there. They break down, they don't perform, they don't get games, because they hadn't done the work leading into it. It's a bit like we've said before, in that the opportunities don't present to the people that aren't ready for them. And you don't actually want them to, because you might get, okay, like say the AFL club threw me a lifeline and said, "At your age, Tim, we need help. Here, go play." How stupid am I going to look? So, oh yeah, I'm an AFL player, but I think we get so caught up in the ego and the label and the outcome that it's like, that's not the be all and end all. It's only great if you've worked for it and you're ready for it. So yeah, I think we kind of get caught up in and social media now, everything's perfect and we all want this life, but it's most of the time isn't true. So I think, what can we do? We can just get back to the things we can control, focus on the daily things we can do to be better, like our training, like our sleep, like what we eat, being a good person, all our standards, having high expectations, but then allowing ourselves to fail, fall short at times, and just keep learning.